I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Eric Kaufmann. He's a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham and author of several books, including most recently, The Third Awokening. Eric and I met at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference a couple months ago and began an interesting conversation on the culture war, particularly in the context of transgender rights and my research on gender dysphoria, which I'm excited to continue today. Eric, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Adam, it's great to be here. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. So I'm sure most of our audience and really most people following media or politics have heard of this phenomenon of wokeness, but if you were to ask me to define it, I would still struggle. But you've written a whole book on this. You taught a whole class on this, the first and probably only university level class, all analyzing wokeness. What is the academic formal definition?
So my one sentence formal definition is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's wokeness in one sentence. Now, it's important to focus on what that is. That is particular attachments to a particular set of groups. So it's particularistic in terms of the way it operates. Now, there is, of course, in addition to that, a more universalistic set of moral foundations, which Jonathan Haidt would call the care, harm, and equality moral foundations, which are general. So protection from harm, including emotional harm, which I think is the critical one, and equal outcomes. So those two principles, which are general, are then being crossed with the woke identity attachments. So the attachments to historically marginalized race, gender, sexual identity groups. And out of that comes a political agenda, which is equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for identity groups, which is really the basis for what we might call DEI. Diversity equity is essentially equal outcomes for identity groups, which means we've got to have quotas, let's say, or affirmative action. The I, inclusion part, is we need to make everyone feel included, so we need to have speech codes to prevent speech which might make people not feel included. And so that's what leads you to restrictions on free speech, for example. Academic freedom comes out of the I part, whereas the attacks on let's say, merit or equal treatment come out of the DE part. The bottom line, however, is that what this is really about is the focus on the identity totems. And that's where my definition of woke focuses, is the fixation or sacralization of those particular groups. Now, we can also talk about groups that are outside the woke holy trinity. So, for example, if you take the homeless or mentally ill people, neurodivergent people, they are still subject to the universal principles of harm protection and equal outcomes. Even poor people. So class is also part of this. So those universal principles would catch groups that fall outside my definition of woke. So, for example, saying that, homeless people are victims of the system and therefore, or drug addicts, we should give them drugs because they're victims of the system. I mean, that is not, in my view, woke. That is, yes, they're being caught by those equality and care harm moral foundations, which are the key progressive moral foundations, but they're not within the definition of woke. And so I try to use it I think it's a useful concept sociologically or in social scientifically, but it needs to be delineated. Anything around vaccines or green, unless it touches on race, for example, or gender or sexuality, then that too, I think, is outside so saying if somebody wants to question the efficacy of masking or lockdowns and is canceled by their university department, that is not woke. That is not a family resemblance on some dimensions, but it is not woke. So that's, again, I want to be clear of what is and isn't woke.
So my sense is that a lot of this broader DEI philosophy, it seems to stem from this strong blank slate empiricism, this belief that humans, all differences are probably learned or a product of environment. So when you point out, for example, homelessness or poverty, there's sympathy there, but there's knowledge that, well, you could always chalk it up to environmental differences. My guess is that when you have these Holy Trinity type categories, it's the things that even the blank slatist can't really attribute to anything but some innate properties, like something like race or gender, you can't really change or get rid of, even if it's socially constructed to some degree. Does that sound right? Does that contribute to the difference of why some of these categories would be sanctified?
I think, yeah. So I think the downstream effect, we have to sort of distinguish between the core beliefs and the downstream effects. So I think the blank slate of slatism, yes, it influences the intellectual genealogy, although I think that's to some degree overplayed. I think it's more of a downstream effect that once you sacralize these groups, you then any sort of disparity has to be explained through discrimination. So disparity equals discrimination is their theory of the world. If there aren't as many women as CEOs, then that's discrimination, for example. So it does lead you to a blank slate position, except, however, except where it doesn't. So clearly when, it's one thing to say race is a social construct, but when a white person wants to become a black person, that breaks it to, so. And now there will be all kinds of rationalizations for why they can't honor blank slates in that situation, but they can with a man wanting to become a woman. That's absolutely working with the blank slate social constructionist philosophy. But why wouldn't a white person becoming a black person? Well, because there are the sacred narratives. Basically, it's because there are sacred narratives and symbols that are being violated. And that's why. Or, for example, if you were to say, well, gay straight is a social construction, and so people who identify as gay, that's just that the mood they happen to be in that day. There's nothing real behind it. Again, you would run into a problem there that, oh no, you're born that way. That's actually quite innate. That's not actually blank slate. So it's selective blank slatism. So blank slate is not in the driver's seat here. I think what's in the driver's seat is really around who is more oppressed, who has more oppression points, who's more sacred in the system. Again, or the system which is structured by the totems of race, gender, and sexuality, and race, gender, and sexual oppression, whoever's higher up in that totem. If they say, yes, I want blank slate, then you can have blank slate. If they say, no, I don't believe in blank slate, then you don't get blank slate. So it's really about the sacred groups that have the control of the system, not any consistent principle like blank slatism.
Did you see this controversial philosophy paper a few years ago in defense of transracialism and comparing it to transgenderism?
Yes, I did. And it's a very good instructive example, really, right, of the limits of blank slate in this philosophy, where it's about reverence for sacred groups and their narratives and their sensibilities. That's what drives the system, not a consistent principle. And that's what this author kind of ran into pretty quickly, was that you transgress. So something like cultural appropriation, you could say, well, because there's really two thrusts in this ideology. I mean, one which is transgressive, and that's, think about postmodernism or trans or social construction, this idea of breaking boundaries. But of course, if you then intrude into a sacred group space, whether that be, say, indigenous or black or whatever, then all of a sudden that is trumped by this other principle. So there's the transgressive principle, which I call modernism, which goes back to the early 20th century, which is really about breaking boundaries and transgressing mores. And then you have the second principle, which is the more leftist principle, the care, harm, and equality principle, which is really about being hurt and harmed and oppressed. And that sort of principle trumps the transgressive principle. Whereas up until the 60s, the cultural left liberals in the US, or anywhere, let's just say, the transgressive was more dominant. And so a Norman Mailer, for example, could, say, square white culture, this is terrible. The Negro is exciting with his jazz and bebop and all, so there would be, on the one hand, but really what that was saying was mainstream white society is repressed and stuff. He has no culture, is unexciting. That was the critique really from about the 1910s with the Greenwich Village Renaissance up until the Beats, that was the dominant focus, was this modernist, transgressive rebelliousness. Mailer, he had, famously nothing but disdain for women's liberation, for example. He was very much a macho guy, like a Hemingway. All these figures on the left were, on the other hand, quite arguably traditional, heteronormative. They weren't really, and even on some of the, yes, Mailer might have said good things about Black culture, but it wasn't like he was talking about systems of oppression, systematic oppression. I mean, he would have been in favor of civil rights, but that's a different argument altogether. So what I mean is that this compound, really, cultural left liberalism is a compound of two elements, one of which is this liberation, which is the sort of transgressive element, and the other is the emancipation, which is the leveling hierarchy and harm protection element. That second element has really come to the fore in the 60s and eclipsed the transgressive. So if you look at cultural appropriation, pornography, pedophilia, these things which would have fit the transgressive type of thrust from that earlier wave have been essentially been suppressed. And so now the argument would be, well, pedophilia harms children, and so there's a harm logic that trumps your desire to be expressive and break boundaries. Whereas, and this is why in an earlier era, some of these postmodernist intellectuals, which were in favor of pedophilia, because they were less constrained by those harm protection, by that harm protection ethos. Similarly with cultural appropriation, where it used to be you wanted to appropriate as many things as possible from as many cultures to show you were a cosmopolitan and you were not a square, bourgeois Westerner. That has now changed to stay in your lane and don't try and appropriate. And that's, again, showing you the power of this more moralistic sort of left emphasis on emancipation. That part of the compound is ascendant, whereas the sort of boundary transgressing exploratory modernism is actually now second fiddle. Both of these are important parts of this ideology, but you can see the tension between them in many ways, which is interesting.
I've heard Jordan Peterson, and he's offering the perspective that this victim, victimizer, oppressed, oppressor, bourgeoisie, proletariat, it all stems out of Marxist philosophy, and that around the time you're talking about, as postmodernism was rising, that basically had an intellectual child with Marxism. And he was trying to popularize this phrase postmodern neo-Marxism, as in you still have that core power struggle dynamic, but now it's not just in economic terms, but in any form of identity terms. So two questions. First, does that analysis sound right? And secondly, why do you think that term didn't catch on, but why has wokeness caught on? What is sticky about the term woke if it's describing a philosophy that's been around for decades?
Well, the first thing to say, I think, is that woke obviously is a more parsimonious term, one word instead of like four, however many Jordan came up with. But the other part of it too is that, so the argument of Jordan there, which fits that of James Lindsay and Chris Rufo, and actually also Fukuyama and even Yashima, I mean, because really what a lot of authors are talking about is this outgrowth out of Marxism. I always say replacing the cartridge that says class or proletariat in the video game console and sticking in the one that says identity. But the same principle of, oppressor, oppress, power, everything's a power struggle, this, and that, of course, that's right at the intellectual level. But my question would be why has it been so successful? So if we were to go back and say, okay, Marxism, clearly, you had well worked out Marxist theory. It didn't really move mountains, even in academia. Even in academia, it was not that persuasive. It persuaded some people, yes, and maybe a significant number of people in the soft social sciences were persuaded, maybe 25% or 20%. But you have to look at resonance, the pickup of ideas, and why the soil is fertile. And I'd say that the soil is much more fertile for woke than it was for Marxism. And so just saying, well, the Marxists pulled out the class cartridge and stuck in identity. I mean, yes, that did happen. And we can track that intellectual history and lineage Do I think that therefore means that you then get this war of position, gradual takeover, intentional takeover of institutions?
Mm.
I think there's some of that. So I don't discount this theory entirely. And certainly some concepts, critical race theory definitely has connections back to Black radicalism and the Black Panthers. There's no question gender ideology as well. These are ideas that come out of critical race or post-Marxism. Now, having said all that, I think that is the smaller of the two streams that form this movement by far. I think the much more prominent one is really just an acceleration of left liberalism. People who would reject Marxism, who aren't driven by politics of class envy or of radical revolution. These are evolutionary rather than revolutionary individuals. But what are they motivated? What are they motivated by? I mean, I guess a quick shorthand into this would be to say that they are bleeding heart liberals rather than cultural Marxists. And so, what is a bleeding heart liberal? It's somebody who takes principles of humanitarianism and egalitarianism, not revolutionary but evolutionary, and says, well, we just need more of these good things. So instead of saying, like Ibram X. Kendi, we need a constitutional amendment and government force to have perfect proportional representation in every branch of society. Instead of that sort of quite intellectual Marxist playbook, it's much more like, well, we're too white, we're too male, we need more diversity, we mean to be more inclusive and more equitable, but it's always more, and there's no boundary. And simply with more and more and more, that evolutionary step, or that will get you to a very radical place. So what are the policies I would say that are associated with this evolutionary bleeding heart left liberalism? Well, I would say affirmative action, speech codes, disparate impact, harassment laws, which would go overboard and say, oh, you criticized Iran's supreme leader, that's Islamophobia, it's triggering to Muslims who work here. That's what I mean is you're taking principles which did a lot of good things, pushing them past an optimum point into extremist territory, because the point is that this cultural, left liberalism as a philosophy on economics has a check, which is markets. You need markets to have economic growth, but you need redistribution or fairness. Okay, fine. We can talk about where the tax rate and where the redistribution level should be, but it's got an inbuilt check. So left liberalism really has become the dominant philosophy economically, and that's stable. On the other hand, on culture, there are no guardrails. My argument is that there's essentially no boundaries to extremism when it comes to culture. So we need more harm protection and more equality, without specifying how you would know that you were equal enough or that you were protecting people enough. There's no real boundary there. It's just off the scale. And so we've kind of gone off the deep end because there's no limiting principle in left liberalism. So all of those policies, affirmative action, speech codes. Now we could also talk about terms like microaggressions, safe spaces, triggering, emotional trauma. All of that has got nothing to do with cultural Marxism. It comes out of a tradition of humanistic psychotherapy, which starts with people like Maslow and Carl Rogers in the 60s. And that's this idea of always believing the patient and always trusting your feelings. And all of this is this psychotherapeutic humanitarianism gone overboard is really where a lot of this comes from. And it also accounts for why something like critical race theory in your diversity training or radical gender ideology is so readily accepted, is because there's already fertile soil there. People have been primed that these are the highest values already. So, and also the taboos of society are all around these identity hot button identity categories. And so if you were to push back on, if someone says, you've got white fragility, and if you argue against that, just proves your white fragility. And if you were to say, well, isn't that like a circular argument? The taint of racism would settle. It's so the taboos of society, the emotional regime had already been established. The terrain, if you fight against these things, you're really going uphill. And maybe the analogy would be in a pious Muslim society, if a Muslim fundamental Islamist Islamic fundamentalist comes along and say we have to separate men and women because it says so here in this commentary, in this hadith, and whatever. If you're a pious Muslim, it's really hard to argue against that because you've already bought into an entire system. And likewise, and so anyone who's arguing against the fundamentalists really has a difficult challenge because the emotional terrain is very much slanted against them. And I think likewise here, when the dominant taboos and highest values are around race, gender, sexuality, if you try and argue against someone who's pushing for fundamentalism in the name of race, gender, sexuality, it's just really difficult because everything's stacked against you. And so I think that's kind of why I say that it's this cultural left liberalism, yet therapeutic left liberalism, that is much more the dominant partner here than the cultural Marxism.
What do you think is going on consciously or unconsciously when there are sort of, it's like one category trumps the other. So for example, the sympathy or the marginalization of Islam discounts the sexism in Islam. So for the most part, like on the Palestinian protests on campus, and I'm Palestinian, by the way, so that was very strange for me to witness because it almost seemed like not virtue signaling per se, but like people taking sides without knowing anything about the history or having any real attachment, just seemingly doing it because it was the politically fashionable thing to do. And I'm not even saying that cynically, like the protesters had bad motives, but it was just strange to me how short our cultural attention span has been because the same thing happened for Ukraine less than a year earlier. And the whole thing lasts like a month. And then people forget about it, even though the situation in Gaza and in Ukraine basically hasn't changed, but people aren't really talking about it as much anymore. The whole thing is strange to witness.
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, you will have noticed that the interpretive framework for Israel-Palestine is essentially a rerun of American history in the sense of settler colonial, whites settling indigenous. That is the sort of framework that is being applied. And of course, that's tapping into the key symbol of race here, right? So race is at the center of this. If, for example, you could very easily imagine another scenario in which Palestinians were seen as the white group. If, for example, a large number of Congolese showed up in the West Bank and wanted to live there, and the Palestinians said no. You could imagine this sort of flipping quite easily. So the point is really that it's whoever's got the more oppression points around one of the sacred totems. In this case, race. So Palestinians would have, more totemic capital, to use Musa al-Gharbi's term, more totemic capital or oppression points in this situation. And it also fits a narrative. One of the key narratives, because one key narrative is, of course, slavery and Jim Crow. Another one is settler colonialism. Now, the settler colonialism thing is more about white v. indigenous. And so that's the white v. people of color indigenous, right? So this is what's now being transposed onto the Middle East. And that's the way to understand it. Now, why does the attention shift? I mean, the attention shifts in part because the Palestinian case is more easily slotted into that critical race theory paradigm of settler colonialism than the Russia v. Ukraine. You really have to work hard to fit that into a sort of white oppressor versus people of color indigenous. Whereas the Palestinian situation fits that more easily. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons that the left is attracted to this, because the left is going to be attracted to situations that have analogies to its sacred narratives. The sacred narratives being around, for example, slavery, colonialism, Jim Crow, settler colonialism. These are kind of the key narratives. And so anything that can be framed as decolonization is going to have a lot of appeal to somebody grounded in that sort of religious belief system. Could we, I mean, so I don't actually think, there are people who say, oh, well, this is about anti-Semitism. And my view is, there are people for whom this conflict is a gateway drug into anti-Semitism. But I actually think what's really at stake here is who's whiter than the other. I mean, if it really wouldn't matter if instead of Jews, these were Christians, if these were Afrikaners, oppression, the South Africa situation. Now, of course, there are real injustices obviously going on in South Africa, going on in Israel. But that's not my point. My point is simply what resonates with the underlying belief system best. Does dark-skinned Sudanese Arabs oppressing Darfur, animists or Christians, is that going to resonate as well? No, it doesn't. It doesn't resonate as well. Now, if the Arabs in Sudan were really white-looking and they were oppressing black people, then I think you would get actually more of a reaction, and this could become a more of a cause célèbre. But left identity, its narrative is going to have to fixate. We know this from general theories of social movements. They can only really keep a few balls in the air, and I could say that about movements on the right. So the conservative religious movements, for example, focused on Sunday closing and drink prohibition. That was a focus. Then at another time it's abortion, at another time it's evolution. But they can only focus on certain symbolic crusades at one time. So this, I think, explains why they're not going to keep up the intensity on Ukraine as well as Palestine, as well as some other place.
The philosophy makes sense to me with its premises and what it's valuing and trying to maximize. And it would make sense to me to adopt in a populist way of the minoritized group itself as a philosophy to motivate this uprising against the dominant paradigm. But what's most confusing to me is that, if anything, wokeness is more common amongst the already privileged class, and it's like this self-flagellatory thing going on. And if anything, like when you see this more woke language, like how Latinos hate the Latinx term, and it's mostly white academics imposing Latinx onto them. Like, what's going on with that? What's the incentive?
So you're right here. So what is going on? I mean, I guess the people who are in the market for a new meaning system. I think Seymour Martin Lipset wrote about this in the 60s with the 60s student revolts, that very well-educated and privileged people are probably more likely to be detached from traditional meaning systems, and therefore to be in the market for new meaning systems. And now that could have been Marxism at one time, but Marxism's pretty austere stuff, and it's not going to have as wide an appeal. But something like this, which involves a humanitarian component. Oops, sorry. I think, is that me or you? No, is that?
Sounds like Skype. Sounds like it's on your end. I don't have Skype.
I know. Don't know what the hell that was. Sorry about that. Okay, let me get back to, where are we here? Sorry about this. What were you talking about again? I lost my train of thought there.
Why is it amongst the more privileged groups that seem to have the pro-minority stance? Because you would think it's going to be the philosophy of the disadvantaged people themselves.
Right. So, basically there's an argument, and Lipset wrote about this in the 60s, that those who are detached from, excuse me, I don't know what. Sorry, this is a real mystery to me as to what's going on. Sorry. Hopefully this
Before
isn't...
Zoom took over for most of the professional conference calls, I think Skype was the big one. And I used to use Skype to have calls with my video game buddies while we were playing. So it's nostalgic for me to hear the tone.
So that isn't Skype, eh? Because I don't even know if I've got Skype on here. That wasn't, anyway. That is just so bizarre. Sorry, I hope that's not going to happen again. I don't know what that was. Right. So you asked about why it's sort of privileged, generally white people who tend to be overrepresented. And we know clearly they were. I mean, the BLM marches, they were overrepresented as a group. This was not generally black people marching. Why is that? And again, there's an argument that says that more privileged people are detached from existing belief systems like religion, for example, or patriotism, and more likely, therefore, to be searching for new forms of meaning. The left does provide an integrated meaning system. The new left version of that is not the Marxist version of proletariat rising up, but rather this idea of identity groups or subaltern identity groups rising up to overthrow systems of identity oppression. That's really and of course that's this goes back to there are connections also to Christianity in a way, millenarianism, this idea of a conflagration, some kind of epic showdown followed by a second coming. There are certain patterns here that you see also in Marxism, that there's going to be a conflict between capital and labor leading to revolution and then the millennium. And so there's that appeal, like, John McWhorter talks about this religion of anti-racism that, we'll come together and walk hand in hand into the light. This is kind of the millennium, Christ's 1,000-year reign on earth. So there is a kind of religious pattern here on the one hand, which is very appealing, but also this identity mobilization. So another element of this is this idea of the myth of the avant-garde. Only a small number of people are in the avant-garde. They are ahead of the others, leading mankind to a kind of promised land. Now, that could be artistically that, we believe in modern art rather than traditional or classical art, and we are therefore in the forefront of creativity. But it could equally be ethical and moral, that we are, we have the most refined sensibility, and we're leading mankind towards this new sensibility, these higher values and these new values. I think that has an appeal as well. Now, I don't necessarily bring in the class analysis the way some others do. I don't think that's irrelevant to Rob Henderson on luxury beliefs, for example, or Musa Al-Gharbi, or earlier versions are the Ehrenreichs talking about the professional managerial class, which doesn't have the earning power of the business elite. It envies the influence of the business elite. It feels it's not getting its due in the culture. It has therefore an adversarial stance towards the financial elite, let's call it, or the existing power system. But on the other hand, it has a snobbery vis-a-vis the less educated. And so their argument is really that in fact, this is a class, the professional managerial class, which is not the business owners, not the working class, but this professional class has its own interests, which involve cultural elitism. Now, I think that's certainly got power to it, and it certainly is a force multiplier, but I still think, unless they truly believed it, I guess I'm a culturalist who thinks you kind of have to believe stuff to do it, at least in the initial phase. So I do think there is genuine belief in these values, that they think, anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, these are the highest values. And we've got to just push them harder and raise consciousness, because we understand and the others don't yet, but they will soon. And then they will revere us after we die. So there's kind of an immortality to this as well, that we will be remembered as the pioneers. But yeah, so I think it's a source of meaning. And so this left, what I call left modernism, you could call it cultural left liberalism, is an integrated belief system which involves myths, symbols, and narratives, which are in terms of motivating behavior, not in terms of the intellectual justification, because my view is the intellectualizing in this case is secondary. So it's a bit like the Daniel Kahneman, people aren't rational, they rationalize. I think, at least in this case, this is not so much an intellectual system like Marxism. This is much more empathizing rather than systematizing. So it's about, first, you become attached to the groups and their causes, Black civil rights, overcoming Jim Crow, overcoming slavery, or it could be indigenous, the cause of the indigenous, the cause of gay, the cause of women. It's the attachment to these particular groups and their stories, which become sacred stories, which you cannot traduce or question in any way or ask for evidence for. So these sort of sacred symbols and narratives are this is the myth symbol complex. So I've studied nationalism for decades, and we have this concept of the myth symbol complex, the myth of origins, of perhaps of migration, of heroic victories. So there are a whole set of myths and symbols which are at the core of many national identities or ethnic identity groups. And similarly, I think um, for left liberalism, there is also a myth symbol complex, and that would involve heroic moments. Now that wouldn't involve the civil rights movement, even though I think one can make the argument that was a very eclectic coalition of groups that actually were involved in the civil rights movement. But civil rights movement would be one, suffragettes in overcoming discrimination and the Stonewall riots and all these. There are a whole set of mythological events and persons in this corpus, and stories, colonialism, Trail of Tears, whatever. That's what drives this movement, not a set of pointy-headed intellectual principles. I think those are secondary.
I've been most curious about the psychology underlying these belief systems, and I like what you said about Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, that the care and fairness core values could be driving a lot of this. And that also makes sense given that those are associated with personality trait agreeableness, and that would also explain some of the large sex difference that you're seeing this mostly as a philosophy of young liberal women. And I have a few ranging in charitable to cynical theories as to what motivates that. On the charitable side, I think there's genuinely a sort of guilt about privilege, especially once you really start to contextualize your circumstances against learning more about world history, like especially for university students in the West, especially if you're at an elite university and even having it paid for. That's a really privileged lifestyle. And it makes sense that you're either going to feel guilty if you just recognize yourself as having all these advantages. And there's probably this natural psychological balancing that's going to want to happen, as in you have to use this for some sort of good. What better good than not just uplifting the disadvantaged, but like uplifting the most disadvantaged and creating your whole worldview around valuing things in proportion to how much the disadvantage disparity is.
Yeah, I mean that's such a set of good points, and I think this idea of guilt, Shelby Steele in his book White Guilt, really pinpointed the shift in the 60s when the anti-racism taboo first emerged. In many ways, a good thing in the sense that you clearly wanted to stigmatize old-style Jim Crow racism, but on the other hand, it very quickly tipped into virtue signaling and cancellation. So the first cancellation was really the Moynihan Report into the Black Family of 1965, which was seen as rankling the sensibilities of African American politicians by the Johnson administration. You had also Steele talks about all of a sudden cultural power shifting from where blacks had to kowtow to whites to now whites having to kowtow to blacks to show I'm not one of the bad old racists. And, we're going to adopt a policy like affirmative action to virtue signal that, again, our institution, we still have legitimacy, moral legitimacy, because look at us, we're doing something anti-racist here. And so I think this signaling side around guilt is very important, but you make a good point around guilt. Now, the question is, however, I mean, you could perhaps argue that throughout history that we've always had privileged people, and so we should always have had movements of kind of self-abasement around privilege. And maybe you could say some religious rituals, Christian religious rituals involve that self-abasement, but it's far from clear to me that there is a universal guilt complex across space and time just because there are universally privileged individuals. So I think it's not enough to have privilege. You actually have to have an ideology that seizes on that as a problem and inculcates that ideology that it is a problem into individuals. So part of my not quibbles with those who take a more purely psychologistic approach, like Jonathan Haidt, and not that they are saying necessarily anything different, but they're looking at things, or Jordan Peterson, more from the psychology angle. dark triad or whatever the personality dimensions are, even agreeable. And like, of course, yes, those things matter. I mean, you see it in the data, absolutely. The only thing I would say is that if you only had big five personality traits as predictors of your model of wokery, I think you'd get quite a small model fit. So that these things are factors. Yes, they absolutely are factors. I guess they also don't explain change over time. Now, this is the other thing. It's a bit like when we look at the surge in, you can look at the surge in mental illness or the surge in bisexuality or trans identity in the last 10 years among young people. Is it the case that certain, agreeable people, women, certain types of people are more affected by these trends? There's no question that the mental health crisis has hit women harder than men. And similarly, the surge in bisexuality has hit women hard, women much more than men. So there's no question that there is a certain sensitivity or receptivity to these ideological trends. But because I'm more of a sociologist and a political scientist, I'm more interested in the intellectual lineage and the processes of transmission of these ideas and why we get this change over time, whilst accepting the psychologist's perspective that certain subgroups in the population, as delineated by personality or by gender or whatever, are going to experience a much larger effect than others. I don't think they're incompatible, but I don't think I tend not to start with the psychological. The psychology, I think, is more of a force multiplier, a kind of receptivity, which is pre-existing. But I guess I've always been interested in explaining the change over time in the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm largely trying to build off my own anecdotal experiences going
Right.
through undergrad and now grad school, all in the last 7 years as this culture war is unfolding, and having a pretty different perspective from my peers who, all things considered, are more woke, and I've been more critical of it. And I've been trying to figure out why. Now, you mentioned Rob Henderson earlier. He and I
Right.
share some background. I wasn't in foster care, but low income, single mother, and then gets to this elite university. We've bonded over that, of the sort of culture shock we experienced there. But what was interesting to me is I would cycle between envy and guilt, basically, because envy in the sense that here were a lot of my peers wealthy from stable families, had a lot of certain advantages. Like whenever I dabbled in the more victimization complex, well, my life would just get worse. It wasn't a good way of looking at things. It makes you kind of more anxious or angry, pretty negative way of looking at the world. And then also, I found that even when I did that, it didn't really work for me because maybe it was growing up in more of this working class, conservative, traditional gender norms type attitude, and had applied for this scholarship program, first to USC and then later for grad school for Harvard. Um, and I mean, I was a deep believer in meritocracy at that point,
Right.
and benefited from an affirmative action to some degree in the sense that these were scholarship programs aimed at poor and first gen students. Um, Although no race based in my case, because Palestinian still counted as white. The other funny thing about that I learned is I think around the same time of this racial civil rights movements you're talking about, Middle Eastern used to be its own distinct non-white category. And from what I understand, there were these campaigns to be classified as white and receive the advantages. And then only in the
Okay.
last decade or so, there's been the campaigning for opposite, like
Right.
to re-implement this MENA category, Middle Eastern, North African, specifically because they don't want to be white, because they want to get the affirmative action bonus again. So that seems to point at something human psychology to me. Like maybe the groups are arbitrary and you just want whatever gives you the most advantage in the context. But I didn't
Yeah, I
really
mean,
dabble. Go ahead.
well, no, it's so interesting because clearly there are self-interested motives and clearly self-interest. If something's in your interest, you might convince yourself that there's some deeper spiritual or moral reason for your position. So I'm not completely discounting those kinds of motivations. I mean, I think you make a good point around also, a different background. The one thing I would say is that if we run models, for example, of support for a statement like, America's a racist country built on stolen land, or there are many genders. We should teach this to kids. I mean, all of these sorts of questions. What characteristics tend to predict support for that? The most prominent is always where you are on a left to right scale. If you've somehow decided you identify as very liberal or on the left, that is by far and away the strongest predictor. This sort of puts the question, further back, what is it that leads someone to identify as being on the left? One of the things we know is that people from more elite backgrounds, is that right? I'm trying to think. So surveys that I've looked at of younger people, 18 to 20, let's say, would show, for example, that class per se makes a little bit of a difference, but it doesn't make that much difference. In all of these models, how much income you've got or the socioeconomic status of your parents is not that large, not that strong a predictor of where you come out on these issues. Now, if you are foreign born or, like in Britain, for example, people from a non-white background are less likely to identify as being very left-wing. They're more likely to not have strong political views. And there is a degree to which, if you're in the white population, you're more politicized or more polarized. So we know that's one sort of finding. In terms of class, I think there's some impact too, to some degree, but only to some degree. I mean, I bet you anything there are quite a few people who come from a working class background who are all in on woke. Now, it may be that they're a librarian, or it may be that they gravitate into a profession that is maybe social work or nursing or a librarian or something where they've kind of moved away they see themselves as having moved away from those roots, but towards something that is a bit more, I don't know, that represents a rejection of the values they were brought up with. You hear these stories all the time. Oh, my parents are so bigoted and I'm so enlightened. And so I'm not sure just the background per se is enough to explain it. I mean, we do know, for example, though, that people who are more oriented, wanting to live where they grew up, what David Goodhart would call the somewheres, who have an attachment to ascribed characteristics, do differ from people who've achieved a lot. So people who've achieved a lot are more likely to identify with their achieved characteristics, which then pulls them away from the ascribed characteristics like ethnicity, race, nation, religion, some of these things that they were brought up in, detaching them from that, which I think is a predictor for receptivity to these new ideologies. So your background or Rob's, I don't know. I'm trying to think whether there's any necessary reason why you would be less receptive. I guess it depends how late in life you pulled away from that class trajectory and entered into the more elite trajectory. And maybe if it happens late enough in life, because people from that working class background are more likely to be attached to their ascribed characteristics, which than their achieved characteristics, which would make them more conservative in a populist way. I mean, there is a correlation there. But it's only a correlation. And I guess I always stress that in the data, socioeconomic status and class, even parental class, is just a really weak predictor of attitudes. And so I'm not sure. I think you and Rob might not be representative of a broader trend, or we'll throw JD Vance in there too. But yeah, I'm just not sure you represent.
Yeah, and then in this weird climate, that's become the fertile soil for people branding my peers, as more conservative. I fit in with the ARC crowd pretty well, which definitely leaned conservative, but mostly it's this classical liberalism. Like, what resonated with me most was Steve Pinker's Enlightenment Now philosophy. And I think that's what contributed in part to this guilt, although I don't necessarily say that as a negative thing. It was more like this global perspective of, wow, even poor Americans are living better lives than basically any other human throughout history. So you pointed to earlier, would you see cross-culturally that anyone with extreme wealth would feel that sort of guilt and want to remedy it, and maybe not. But I'm wondering if something uniquely about this type of globalism and this paradox of even if you're poor, you're wealthy. You have vaccines, you have food, you have clean water, like all this stuff.
Well, there is this argument, this Maslowian argument that when you remove scarcity, war and hunger or economic privation, that people move up the Maslowian hierarchy of needs towards self-expression values. This is sort of the Ron Inglehart, Pippa Norris, and they're great, and I love their work about value change. So their argument for liberal value change is that security breeds liberalism, essentially, to put a very crude spin on their views, and I don't want to do that, but and I guess again, I'm not entirely persuaded in the sense that I think we had shifts in intellectual trends that have changed substantially over time. Often the intellectuals, I mean, even if you take something like the Islamic revival, conservative movements, or at least conservative culturally, they're often led by relatively privileged people. Now, that on its own doesn't constitute evidence against the theory. But I guess my view, if you look certainly post 1945, when we've had, certainly in North America, but also increasingly in Europe, you've had this safety and security. We've still had various ideological currents. Now, we have had that post-60s care, harm, equality thrust, which has been a constant. But we've also seen, however, economically, New Deal up until the 70s, it was more social democratic, if you like, from the 70s with stagflation and the oil shocks up until, the 2007-8 economic crisis. That was a period of sort of deregulatory capitalism where Friedmanite ideas were more popular. So you certainly had these waves of ideas, some of which are more about protecting the poor, others which are more about thrusting individualism within an environment of generally rising security. And a lot of this is down to framing. I mean, is somebody who has plenty to eat but doesn't have a job living in a town in Ohio, they can be framed as insecure, or they can be framed as secure. So I think the framing, which is cultural, is actually very important here, and not just the raw fact that the guy isn't starving to death or dodging bullets. It's not to say that certainly a war would have an impact on the culture. I don't doubt that for a second, but I just think within a period of relative peace, I think ideas have their own logic and their own power, and they can lose power and gain power. I mean, why did the idea of open immigration in America lose favor amongst progressives in the 1880s and 90s, and then gain favor from the 1910s and 20s again? I mean, there are these currents that just change. Why did prohibition? I mean, obviously, to some degree, a policy can be implemented like prohibition. It can be seen as a failure, and therefore people can turn against it. Ideas can change because practically they don't work. And maybe now some of the ideas, I mean, I would argue that some of the ideas of the left liberals, especially with policy failures in the West Coast blue cities, I think that is having an impact on the viability of these ideas. So I don't think ideas just are an epiphenomena of material security the way Inglehart and Norris would have it. I think there's also ideas have their own logic, they're memes with their own code that unfolds over time. And so, yeah, I guess I'm more, again, it gets back to me having a more culturalist approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because when I was an undergrad, I was really reaching for these types of core beliefs to ground myself and like frame my identity and purpose. And it was really unstable because, again, I could bounce back and forth between, am I wealthy and privileged, and should I feel guilty about that because I'm on full scholarship at an elite university? I have enough to eat. I get to read great books, and I have a lot of free time, and like just all privilege because most people don't have those luxuries. Or should I feel envious, and should I frame myself as disadvantaged because here I am, this person who grew up in a disadvantaged household, Palestinian, and like play the whole woke identity game. I didn't take that too seriously, but certainly it was on the table. And I witnessed peers of mine in the scholarship. And there was this strong kind of disgust aversion when I saw them doing it. And I'm thinking, like, you're already getting a full scholarship. What more do you want? Like, what do you mean you're disadvantaged? And they actually told us that this founder of this Questbridge scholarship, he basically framed it like this isn't a gift or an entitlement. It's a contract that you're gonna make something with your life. And I got really into listening to Jordan Peterson around the same time too. And this whole compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. That seemed to
Right.
really stabilize me, and it helped a lot and set me down this psychology pathway.
That's really interesting because, yeah, I think certainly if you do come from a subaltern group or however described, I mean, if you actually adopt the victimhood culture, you are not going to help your own progress, your own happiness, as an individual. I mean, and this is another interesting whole other area of mental health and how victimhood culture and the whole ideology has affected people's mental health. But, I remember doing one experiment where I had people read a bit of Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is all about, police violence and brutality against the black body and all these sort of critical race theory tropes and black respondents who read those passages actually, when asked about on a number of self-efficacy measures, locus of control measures, they came down significantly weaker. So these sorts of messages really do remove your sense that you're in control of your life. It had a significant impact and it replicated a number of times. So if you actually take these ideas seriously, they can be quite enervating and actually aren't great for your own mental health. So actually, it's a terrible route to go down. Now, as a sort of way of analyzing society, I mean, I'm all for anything that's evidence-led and that's rigorous. The problem is when you aren't really allowed to contest these narratives, then it can't be scientific. And so, um, but it is interesting. Yeah, I mean, so you had a number of different options, and you sort of decided to reject what possibly would have been a path of least resistance or a somewhat alluring message that in a way you have cultural capital within the system, you're a victim and within a victimhood culture. And I can see the appeal of that. Although I think what's interesting is if you actually look at the data, um, often, the very groups that are supposed to be lapping this stuff up are actually less keen on it
Yeah.
than the progressives who are pushing it. And I think that is also that became very evident during the Great Awakening when you looked at, for example, measures like racial resentment. Irish Jews and Italians worked their way up, blacks should as well. These sorts of questions. And you would get African Americans coming out more conservative, quote unquote, than white liberals on these measures. And yes, so this was something that was very noticeable and very. It's also interesting to me that, I mean, if you look at the mental health crisis, it's affected minorities the least, or at least if we're going to talk about increases in anxiety and depression, those have hit the groups that have been hit by that are disproportionately sort of white female, white LGBT. That's sort of who's really gone off the scale in terms of having these mental health problems. So I mean, and also on some of the free speech measures, again, um, should somebody who comes to campus who says Black Lives Matter is a hate group be allowed to speak on campus? There's no real difference between minorities and whites in their views on that. But there's a huge difference between men and women or gay and straight on those sorts of questions. So yeah, there's an interesting phenomenon going on, but I think it does speak to this idea that progressives are far more invested in these ideas than the ostensible beneficiaries.
Hmm. But it's given me trouble with the conservative attack on wokeness, where they frame it like universities are brainwashing our children. And maybe that's true, and I was somehow an outlier. But like I said, my experience was with deep exposure. So like you would think that at USC and at Harvard, I'd be at the highest risk for the brainwashing. But if anything, I think I came out way more conservative, more as reaction to it than I would have had things just been normal, no culture war. I probably wouldn't have thought as much about it. But the more I thought through it, the more these ideas were kind of off-putting to me. And I think the core off-putting part was how they're kind of infantilizing, like, even though they're ostensibly about support for these disadvantaged groups. Like as soon as you place yourself like you're championing the theory, you're going to support them. It's kind of patronizing. And in a strange way, it's kind of reinforcing the idea that you're the privileged class because you have to step in and rectify it,
Mm.
because implying that they can't do it themselves.
Right. And I guess that's also quite empowering for the believer that you have a kind of white savior or male savior role to play, and therefore you are, you are a kind of moral leader. Again, this myth of the avant-garde, you are an ethical avant-garde. I think that's very appealing. Um, but yeah, just sort of thinking about the universities, I agree. On the other hand, when we do talk about this brainwashing thing, again, I think we have to look at the data, which would suggest that universities don't have a big impact. So we have a number of studies now on political beliefs of students entering the system and when they graduate. We also have the FIRE survey data, which where we can see people's political beliefs across the 4 years that they're there, and one would expect over time for them to become more liberal if this were true. Some studies find an effect, others don't. The effects are very small, even if they exist. They're generally very small. They are generally in both directions rather than one direction. They are, some of this arises from peers versus, if I were to put money on it, I'd say instruction in the classroom has probably no net effect on people's politics, would be my general belief if I had to put money on it. Now, I wouldn't say the same about K to 12. There, I think we have got some evidence that there is significant malleability in that group. And so there, I think the case is much stronger for intervention in the curriculum. University, I don't think that it matters very much. Um, and so I think this is it's partly a belief on the right. It's partly a stick to beat the universities. I mean, I'm kind of ambivalent with all this stuff that's occurring now from the Trump administration. I mean, I'm very critical of the Trump administration. I have been in print. Many of the things they're doing, I think, are disastrous. But, on the universities, right? I think again they're applying a sledgehammer where a scalpel was probably necessary. So I don't believe that governments should butt out of universities. I think that as long as the universities are receiving money, I think it's reasonable for the government to say, well, we're not going to fund scholar activism. We're not going to fund political curricula. We're not going to fund, scientifically unrigorous political ideology driven DEI. I think that's all reasonable. What I don't think is reasonable is to start dictating that, you can't teach certain things. It's one thing to say we won't fund it, but you can teach it. So if you want to teach critical race theory and people want to take it, I don't think from an academic freedom point of view, I don't think you should be saying you can't teach it. The second thing is I don't think you should be, the anti-Semitism thing I do think is heavily overblown. I have a Jewish background myself, but I just think this is a bit of a stick to beat the university, and also think it actually in some ways reinforces some of the things which I find quite problematic in the whole woke corpus, which is the idea of sacred groups and narratives. And I just think it's a fine line, right? I mean, you want to clamp down on stuff that is directly targeting or harassing people who are Jewish, but you don't want to limit speech and views as long as they're within the First Amendment, with it, that they're not inciting violence. So I just think the IHRA definition again is not legally, it's not First Amendment compliant. So I think that's going too far. So I just think in a lot of ways gone too far, and also just the method, the way they've gone about it is so adversarial. But on the other hand, I think that without external pressure, the cocoon, the comfortable DEI political discrimination cocoon, which has existed in almost all universities. I mean, not just Harvard. And there's no, you can have the best arguments about, hey, we should persuade, we should have free speech, we should have toleration, and we should have political neutrality. None of that is really going to go anywhere without, unfortunately, force from trustees and donors and government. And the sad reality is universities had 40 years to clean up their act, and they did the reverse. They just doubled down and leaned into the prejudices of activists, and just essentially did nothing to reform themselves. And so on speech codes, on affirmative action, you name it, they just sort of took the most progressive line possible. They made political statements, and now they find themselves kind of hoist on their own petard. And now that doesn't mean I believe in the destruction of the universities. They are, and it's not just because I had a wonderful year at Harvard in 2008-9 at the Kennedy School. I mean, so yeah, I do think universities are very important special places. But I also think there had to be an external jolt in order to upset the cozy consensus that existed, in which radical woke activism essentially set the tone. And it's not to say they got their way entirely, but they set the tone. And not only that, I mean, you have the white-hot critical race theorists and their domination of certain spaces in the university, and you have the DEI committee and their crazy stuff and the diversity statements and the cancellations, and you have all of that. But you also have subtler stuff, which I think is more important in many ways, which is the self-censorship, the incentives to not study things like, can I make an argument that family structure contributes to the race gap in earnings? Like, these sorts of obvious data-led arguments are essentially ruled out of the curriculum, ruled out, marginalized. And that's not good for a social science that is faithful to the real world, right? So in so many ways, I mean, this is kind of the focus of my conference on post-progressivism in June in Britain, which the entire truth-seeking mission and knowledge production system has been warped by these subtle red lines that say, you're not allowed to ski over here, you must stay on the piste. If you make, as evolutionary arguments about the biological basis of human behavior, maybe we're never going to see 50-50 men and women pilots or engineers, and maybe for CEOs, we're never going to see 50-50. Maybe we just have to accept that, and we just to constantly beat ourselves up and say this is some evidence of patriarchy and sexism. Maybe there is a biological basis for some of this. Now, we can argue about how large that component is, but I think the denial of that's just another example of these kind of subtle limitations on the pursuit of truth that exist. And so I kind of use the example of religious toleration, where sometimes it was necessary for, if the Anglicans wanted to have an Anglican theocracy, and they, like in Britain, or in England, the Anglicans are dominant. In Scotland, the Presbyterians were dominant. They didn't want competitors. But competitor religious sects arose. Like in England, it might have been the Baptists and Methodists, Scotland, the Free Church, and they couldn't crush these movements. And at some point, the power of these counter movements was such, because they couldn't crush them, they had to come to an accommodation. And I think something similar is going on here, where woke left liberalism dominates in the universities, dominates the faculty. And let's not forget, faculty supported mandatory diversity statements. So the faculty and the university has a dominant orientation. You have this minority. Now, all of a sudden, this minority has allies from outside, whether they be trustees or donors or the government. And they now have a lot more power, and the dominant left liberals can no longer crush them the way they did in the past. So they're forced to come to an accommodation, which means their minds expand, and they are more receptive to ideas like political neutrality, academic freedom, viewpoint diversity, all the things which they just poo-pooed and could brush away and never pay a price. They didn't have to have an argument. They just, well, we're in control here and screw you. Now they have to listen. And so I'm like, that's a good thing. Now, of course, it's risky because you've got somewhat of a nut who's pushing this stuff from the government side. And so I do think it's a risk. We do need to come to an accommodation. I hope that accommodation is reasonable and principle-based and not purely about who's got the power. I think that's too bad. But I just don't see any other way this could have happened. Despite the greatest efforts of the Academic Freedom Alliance and the persuasion people, they weren't listening. They never were going to listen. And so I'm afraid the external intervention is probably the only way things could have changed. But it's going way overboard, which again, I lament. I would hope the legal system would be the check on that. We'll see.
Eric, I really appreciate your nuance with the history and with interdisciplinary ideas from sociology to psychology to philosophy and balancing the opposing political perspectives as well. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Adam. It's been great. And good luck with your work.
Thank you.